And it looks like we are recording. All right, so thanks for joining us for this presentation. I'm Casey Westerman. I'm the Agnes Scott College Archivist, and this is a short illustrated presentation about the history of Founders Day, Sophomore Parents Weekend, and the Sophomore Ring Ceremony. So the observance of George Washington Scott's birthday, February 22nd, as Founders Day was announced by President F.H. Gaines early in the session of 1918. George Washington Scott, of course, was born on the same day that, born on the birthday of George Washington, and hence his namesake. So February 22nd, always being the president's birthday, was also the birthday of the first founder of the college. From 1918 until 1956, Founders Day was a holiday on the college calendar, meaning that there were no courses taught on that day. For many years, there was a festive dinner on campus for which students, especially seniors, would dress in costumes of George Washington's era. The students would perform a skit, they would sing songs as colonial characters, including George Washington, Martha Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and some other people, Ben Franklin, Lafayette. After dinner, after the skit, the students would move to the gymnasium, and a group of them, also dressed in costume, would dance the minuet, after which there would be a general community dance until supposedly a reasonable hour. So here are a few illustrations, just a few photographs of the students dressed in colonial costume to celebrate Founders Day. So 1918, 1922, 1931. So we do have a video of one of these from 1932, and I'll play this and kind of give you a minute. There's no sound for this, but the background is pretty recognizable, and you can see, again, the students in costume. You can see some dramatic theatrical performance as well as dancing. So, and I do wish we had the sound for that. Here we have the following year, 1933, and I include this photograph because here at the center you see then President James Ross McCain. He was the president from 1923 until 1951. Before that, he was the vice president of the college under Frank Gaines. Frank Gaines had worked directly with George Washington Scott. And I include President McCain here because he really was the driving force. He was the one who kind of kept the torch lit for Founders Day. So after 1918, in addition to the on-campus performance which we've seen here, groups of alumni in various cities would have meetings on February 22nd. So it was a holiday for alumni as well as for students. And for many years, on Agnes Scott Founders Day, there would be a radio broadcast, not only in Atlanta, but in some cases even kind of various other radio stations around the world, generally in big population centers. So if you were living in Chicago on Founders Day, you'd be able to turn into a certain radio station at a certain hour and hear President McCain give his annual address, kind of talking about the college, followed by Dean Hopkins, who had a message for alumni. And this was not only an alumni event, it was also kind of intended to be recruitment, because the idea was that there might be high school students who were considering whether or not they wanted to go to college, and this was advertising Agnes Scott as a women's college for a national audience. So during World War II, the broadcast was abandoned, and they stopped doing the campus performances. In 1945, the minuet, the colonial costume, came back just once, but as they moved into the 1950s, the students became less and less interested in the purpose of Founders Day. The only thing they were still excited about was the fact that it was a campus holiday and there were no classes taught that day. So when Wallace Alston became president in the early 1950s, he eventually, after a few years, decided to discontinue the holiday and to emphasize George Washington Scott's birthday by other means. And that's when Founders Day took the form that it still has today, which is a convocation, usually with a speech, either from the president or from an invited speaker. And at this point, James Ross McCain, who you see here as a young man, he was the president emeritus and still a regular presence on campus. And we have a 20-minute recording of the first address that he gave on this new version of Founders Day. And I'm just going to play about 3 minutes of this here because I want you to hear him talk about not only George Washington Scott, but also primarily about Agnes Scott herself.
Simply two phases of Colonel Scott's work and influence. I'd like to start by giving just one incident in the relationship of Colonel Scott to his mother. I don't know why she did it, but on October 30th, 1868, which was just during the Reconstruction time, you know, she wrote a special prayer and sent it to all of her 12 children. And she made a very special petition in that prayer that God would guide each one into the field of best service and best usefulness. Well, the next Tuesday after this prayer was written and sent, there was an election in Florida, and Colonel Scott was running as a Democratic nominee for the governorship of the state. And he got an overwhelming vote in that state, so that he would have been, by all ordinary odds, elected the governorship and would have served. But he was ruled out by the carpetbag regime that was then in charge because he was an ex-Confederate officer. And so his mother's prayer was really answered. If he had become governor of Florida, he never would have been the founder of Agnes Scott, humanly speaking. And so he was destined to a much greater service than being a mere governor, even of Florida. His mother was Agnes Irvine, I-R-V-I-N-E. She was born in Northern Ireland, which was the hotbed, as you know, of the pure Scotch people. And she came to this country when she was 17 years old. She came with her mother and started with her sister. Her sister died on the way. It took 36 days to make the journey across the Atlantic as she came, and so it was a long and sad voyage. She and her mother went from Philadelphia 200 miles west to Alexandria in central Pennsylvania, where she had relatives, and that's where she made her home. When she was 22 years old, she married Mr. John Scott, who was a widower with 5 children. And so at 22, she was beginning a rather large-sized job of her own. She and Mr. Scott had 7 children, and so her whole family of children was 12, and that's a good-sized job for anybody to look after. She was well educated for a young girl of 17. She had been to good schools in Ireland. We have her arithmetic over in the library. Miss Byers might like to see it sometime if you're good. And it has an inscription of her own in her own handwriting that's interesting. I would hate to take an examination on that arithmetic. It's vastly harder than anything that our sugar-coated school courses now, and arithmetic give, and I'd like for you to look at it and see what sort of a course she did take. She was very thorough in her training in poetry and.
Right. So, and again, that goes on, but just kind of include that to demonstrate that James Ross McCain, he seemed to be really the champion of George Washington Scott during his time at the college and before and after. So we have a number of short histories of Colonel Scott's life written by McCain. So in 1958, which was the first instance of the new version of Founders Day, was also the first instance of what was then called Sophomore Parents Weekend. This was introduced because there was the idea that Agnes Scott needed some activity involving parents other than investiture and commencement. And the reason it's Sophomore Parents Weekend was that there needed to be something for the sophomores. The seniors already had investiture. Juniors had something called Junior Jaunt, which was an annual event, and the freshmen had enough on their plates anyway. The sophomores needed something that was uniquely theirs. The Parents Weekend was scheduled for the winter quarter because that was the point when students seemed to have very low energy and they really needed a shot in the arm. So the first Sophomore Parents Weekend was 1958. In the early years, parents would attend classes with their daughters, and other events, including a lunch for parents and their daughters, would be kind of hosted and arranged and organized by members of that year's sophomore class. In 1990, it changed from Sophomore Parents Weekend to Sophomore Family Weekend. And more recently, the whole weekend has included Founders Day, Convocation, and the Sophomore Ring Ceremony, in addition to the events for parents. So just kind of moving through the photographs, you get a lot of photographs of the students with their parents, and you can watch fashions change. It was considered an unusual thing that the sophomores would organize and lead the event, and therefore the seniors, who were their sister class, would serve them in a way that more typically the sophomores would serve the seniors. There was a creative arts program that would be put on for each year's Sophomore Parents Weekend. And here's a photograph from 1971 of a performance for the audience of parents. So just I'd mentioned that there would typically be an invited speaker for Founders Day. And these were usually, sometimes it would be the president of the college, sometimes it would be a professor of the college, but sometimes it would be the president of a nearby college or related college. You'd have guest speakers who were professors from other schools. And in 1988, Shirley Chisholm was the invited speaker. She was the first African-American woman in Congress. She was the first African-American major party candidate for president, and also the first female major party candidate for president in the early 1970s. Just again, some more photographs. Sophomore Family Weekend from 1990. 1999 Founders Day weekend, Betty Scott Noble, who was the namesake of the Heritage Center in the library now, was the invited speaker to speak again on Agnes Irvin Scott and her family. And I'd mentioned, obviously now the sophomore class ring ceremony is a part of the weekend celebrations. Class rings have been a part of Agnes Scott tradition since the early 20th century. The earliest rings that we have in special collections are from 1919. They don't look anything like the current version. It was a simple gold signet ring with the seal of the college and the year of the class on the side. The design was updated in 1934. It was radically changed to add the black onyx stone. The graduating year is engraved on one side, and BA or AB at the time is engraved on the other side. The class of 1935 was the first class to get the ring. There have been other evolutions that have happened over the years. For example, the rings are now available in silver. Originally, they were only in gold. They were not originally given to students when they were sophomores. originally, when the tradition began, the senior class was getting their rings in the fall of their senior year. They would actually get them in the mail. They would be mailed to their parents' house.
Can I do my thing, or do you need to me to?
I'll respond to that.
Sorry, I'm hearing somebody else's voice on here. So in 1954, it changed to students' junior year. And at this point, students would go to an office and pick up their ring. 1965 was the spring of a student's sophomore year. 65 is when it became a sophomore tradition. But the first ring ceremony began in 1989. It was for the class of 1991. The ceremony was held in Rebecca Walt's reception room for 2 years and then moved into Gaines Chapel. An alumni speaker was added. And the ring ceremony has usually, in this form, usually occurred during Sophomore Family Weekend. Here's some recent programs from the, well, recent, last 20 years worth of ring ceremony programs. We don't have a complete set of these programs, but we do have a nearly complete set in the archives. And just to bring things up to date to 2021, for obvious globally important circumstances, this is the first Founders Day which is entirely online. So for those of you who are attending it, I want to thank you for being part of a historic and possibly, hopefully, a one-off situation. Nonetheless, it is a landmark in the history of Founders Day. So most of the information here is, most of the textual information here is drawn from a book, Lest We Forget, which is the 1983 history of the college, written by Walter McNair, who was the person who, in 1958, he was the professor who suggested the creation of Sophomore Parents Weekend. And drawing much here on the work of my predecessor as archivist, Marianne Bradley. Her history of the traditions at Agnes Scott College are available up on the website of the archives. And if anyone has questions or obviously I'm happy to take questions now at this point, but going forward, if you'd like to kind of start your own research in the archives, just feel free to email archives@agnescott.edu and we'll get started. So if anyone has questions about the history of these traditions, I would like to answer them to the best of my ability.
Please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask Casey any questions you have. I had one, Casey, while people are thinking.
Yeah.
It looked in the early film that you showed, it looked like there were steps at the open archway part of the colonnade. Is that something you can document, or did I misinterpret that?
No, I think that's the case. I think that that's something that was eventually taken out for ADA reasons. That it was in order to make the campus accessible. But let's see, I'm not sure if it shows up in the very first shots here. Yeah, so you can see the steps pretty clearly there. Which you're right. I think that there is now a ramp there, isn't there?
No, well, there's a ramp at a 45-degree angle to the steps that we're seeing, but it's a straight, flat walkthrough under that opening right now. So unless that gets changed with Maine's renovation, I guess. So yeah, it reminded me of the funny platforms we used to have in the main reading room in the 70s here in McCain. So just one of those things that's changed over time, I guess.
Right. I think there was some architectural features had to be drastically revised just to make it possible to navigate the campus on in a wheelchair, which I know as late as the 80s it was still, I think, very difficult to get around some buildings.
Okay. Other questions? Amy Level is saying that she thinks the ramp was part of the Rebecca renovation. It's been here at least the 15 years that I've been here, Amy. I remember that for lining up for baccalaureate and so forth. I think there's been a ramp towards Rebecca and one towards Maine. under the colonnade.
Yeah, there was a renovation of Rebecca when I was a student in the
Oh.
late 80s, and I think that may be when that ramp came in.
Gotcha.
Well, so there's there's a new project to create an architectural history of the college, and this is a great question right here. This is something that I should be able to kind of figure out, at least from photographic evidence, roughly when that happened. But it would make sense if there was a renovation in the late 80s that it might have happened then. Anyway, so again, if you'd like to see more photographs, if you have any questions about other traditions, please feel free to reach out and let me know. I'd like to thank everyone for attending.